Drawing from photos is a great thing to do. We can't always get to a location, and it means we can draw things that we might never even see, let alone draw in real life. But there are some fundamental differences between how a scene looks in a photo and how we see that scene in real life with our eyes. Those differences, if we're not aware of them, can result in our drawing looking less realistic than we want. Let me explain what these differences are and how you can compensate for them when you draw once you understand them. The basic reason for the difference comes because we see out of two eyes that both send information to the brain, and because there are two and one is on each side of our nose, one of them sees a slightly different view of whatever we're looking at to the other. And the brain takes these two slightly different views and combines them into the one image that we perceive we're seeing. And it uses these two slightly different views to create a sense of depth. We see things in 3 dimensions. We get a sense of distance, of close, of mid-ground, of far away. But a camera is just one lens, if you like, one eye only. It only sees one image from the one viewing point. So photos from a standard camera don't get the 3D magic that we get when we look through our two eyes. Therefore, our photos don't look three-dimensional. When we look at a photo, most of the time, we can supply that sense of shape, depth, distance from our imagination. But when we use a photo as a reference, this lack of three-dimensionality, this lack of depth, creates issues that really do make it harder for us to draw a scene that looks realistic. The best example I can think of to explain this is a tree canopy. Here we have a photo of a large tree. I use this as a reference for a very large 6-foot painting that I did. And what we see in this picture is that for a very large, obviously round tree, it looks very flat. And all these leaves, it's hard to really work out what the shape of the tree is. Let me show you the painting that I did and see if you agree that straight away we have a much stronger sense of the roundness of the tree, the shape of the tree, and the depth in the tree. What do you think? Do you agree that the painting gives us a stronger sense of this tree is a giant roundish canopy where this part is coming closer to us, these parts are receding away, and these parts are the furthest parts away from us completely. But to show how this impacts on drawings from photographs, I'm going to pair up some of my original photo references with the drawings I did from those photos and show some of the techniques I used to inject a greater sense of realism into my drawings. In life, looking at this, we would tend to be not seeing what's behind it with nearly this clarity, because our eyes would focus at this distance and we actually wouldn't see these details very clearly. But of course, a camera captures that. So when I draw this, I'm trying to put back in the sense of not just that this is closer, but this is the thing we're meant to be looking at, and what's behind is background. So even though being in the center, this is clearly the subject, I've tried to make it more emphatically so. I've done that through my use of tone, but I've also done it by using a heavier line for the spire. I've drawn more detail, more carefully, to reflect the fact that we see the closer things that we're focused on in more detail. These things that are further away, I can hardly draw them with a blurry line with a pen, but I use a finer pen and a lighter touch. And it can be tempting to become a slave to our reference and to include too many details. Here we have another rooftop view of Bern. We have the problem of so much detail that the camera picks up. And you can see the way I've used weight of line to create some of this distinction. And I have used a heavier line as this line of snaking rooftop ridges winds through the street. There is a lot less detail on this side of the street, and it's more gesturally drawn to give the sense that this is further away. Because in real life, we see less detail further away, some of us even less than others. The camera catches it all, but if we were to reproduce all of this, it doesn't create the effect that we get when we look with our eyes. This building is the star of the show, but I like the dynamic of this pedestrian walking towards it being a character that we could follow his eyesight and follow his journey that will take us there. So I created an emphasis on him by creating a little separation from all the background lines, drawing him with a heavier line, as I did with this tree, to bring it closer to us than this building. Even in this building, I drew this section with a heavier line and more detail than I did the further along we went, or I used the same pen from here to here for the buildings. The further away I got, I drew them with a lighter, quicker line to get a lighter, quicker effect. If we look at the corner here, you can see I've drawn these things with a very light line to give a stronger sense of distance than we would have had if I'd actually drawn the detail that I can see here with the camera, and still lighter for the far distance and far less detail. Particularly when we get this foreshortening, this compression, this narrowing of what we see as it moves further away, we end up having too many lines that physically we're able to fit in the space if we're still using the same pen. The temptation is that we'll try to draw some of the detail at least that we see in our reference, and we'll be trying to put too many lines in, and to physically fit them on the page, we'll separate each line out a little bit from where it should be, and therefore the whole width of our building will increase and the proportions will not look right. So by making choices with our line work and what we actually draw in terms of detail and so forth, we can create various primary and secondary focal points that mimic the sense of when we look at a scene, we don't actually see the whole scene in this much detail all at once. What we're talking about isn't just something that happens as we go off to the side. These effects happen as we go up. As I went further up to represent the effect that happens when we're primarily looking more at ground level, I drew the upper stories with a lighter pen and a lighter touch and with less detail. Here we have an entranceway of a building in Berlin. And because, in my mind, this is the really interesting part, I've drawn it with a much heavier line and with more detail. And it really does draw the eye. And what's above and off to the sides with a lighter touch with less detail. Even though in the reference photo, really, you can see the detail up here just as clearly as down here. Because in life, again, if we're looking at this, then what's around it will be less distinct, less clear. So in my thinking, this creates a greater sense of realism of how something looks than the more flattened, all over detail that a photo gives. This is the sort of scene where the camera picks up incredible detail all the way up the street. But the truth is, in life, we can't focus on all this detail all at once. And our eyes aren't even capable of picking up a lot of this detail this far away. And while we might use so many vertical lines to draw the windows that are closest to us, we would have great trouble drawing all the lines that we can see here, let alone up here. There's just not enough space in the width of the facades as they compress, moving further away from us down the street. So when I drew this, even though there's no tone or hatching, I tried to create this illusion of depth, of distance, of moving away by reducing the width of my line, reducing the weight that I pressed my pen down with, reducing the detail that I drew in the windows here closest with the details I drew here and then here again. And this works in small, quick, simple sketches. I drew this for a video on using a 4x4 grid, but I still use these techniques to create a sense of depth that's lacking in the drawing, to bring these things closer, this closer than this. Stronger, heavier lines, bolder line work that becomes lighter and more tentative and with less detail as it moves back. So this warehouse at the very back is drawn with a lighter touch, with less detail, less lines, and also to a degree with less precision, because we see things less clearly the further away they are when we're looking at something in the foreground. And when we have a subject where there's a massive stonework or brickwork, because the photo shows it all so clearly, we can feel compelled to draw it. But again, in life, when we're looking at this building, we're not seeing all the individual stones, all the individual bricks all at once. There may be moments where we look at just sections of it and think, oh, look at those bricks, or look at those stones, or that's beautiful stonework. But we don't see it on all the building all at once. The stronger thing we see are the lines of the buildings, the shapes of the windows, the major architectural elements. So when we draw, it can be a great temptation to try and draw all the bricks. Now, I know that is a style, and if it's done well, it can look amazing. For those of us producing sketches where we're trying to capture the feel and the effect of the scene, we want to get a sense of how it looks in life. Then something like this, I find, works better. where what we do is we suggest something of the pattern of the bricks of the stonework without drawing all of them, without doing all the detail. And when we do this, the important thing is that we get the scale correct, that we don't draw our stones larger or smaller, or our bricks larger or smaller than they are in reference to whatever architectural details are around them, often windows. If we make our bricks larger than they really are when we draw them, then we change something fundamental about the appearance and sometimes even the scale we perceive the building to be. But if we have a few sections where we do a fair bit of detail, a few sections where we just suggest even less, we can then have lots of sections where we don't draw any, and yet the brain is still seeing this pattern in parts and reading it across the whole structure. Here's another scene in Edinburgh where we have these backpackers very close to us in the front. We have buildings that are closer, buildings a bit further away, buildings further away again, and then the castle in the distance. Again, with the flattening of the camera, we see all of this in a lot of detail, and the temptation can be to let the detail overwhelm us and to try and draw it all and to get what will look like an overdrawn drawing in the end. So by now you should be able to spot all my techniques before I even mention them. The foreground drawn in more detail with a heavier line, stronger tones as well, and then adjusting those elements as the subject moves further away. Greater detail, less detail, least detail. A very light touch for detail and for tone on the crag overlooking the city. This was a relatively quick freehand drawing. These techniques can be used on location sketching to create the three-dimensional effects that we see in that case in real life. Here's a beautifully carved balustrade. And again, the photo has captured with alarming detail the complexity of this carving as it moves further up. And if I tried to draw it with a single pen, in the detail I see here, it would just be a dark mess up the end. So my approach was to draw this closer section in a great deal of detail, because in life we see closer things in more detail. And as the design moved further away, I tried to capture the feel of it more than the exactness of it. The fact that it was these round spirals, that these were natural plant shapes, and that there was a repetition as we went along. That something like this was appearing here and here. And one of the great things about how our brain works is that if we take more care and pay more attention and draw in more detail some of the closest things, we only have to suggest them with less and less exactness as they move further away for the brain to see them with greater detail than they really are. One of the comments I've enjoyed most from my posts on Instagram is someone who said, "I keep being amazed at all the detail that you draw. Then when I zoom in and look closely, it's not there." That really pleases me, because that shows the approach I take in my drawing is very effective. Here we have an old building. The detail we have down this side, again, is all too crisp and definite and tempting to draw. So when I drew it in this freehand sketch, as I moved further along, I kept using the same pen, but I drew the lines quicker and more lightly, and just trying to suggest the detail here with a couple of round lines to suggest what we could see far more clearly in these closest windows. And the effect, looking at the front, is that I've drawn all of this side in great detail, but if you look closely, I haven't at all. See, up here, there really is just a very rough, quick gestural suggestion of the actual details of the architecture which is happening here. I thought to finish, I will show you an example where I don't employ these techniques for, if you like, overcoming or making up for the deficiencies of a photo. Here we have a street scene in Edinburgh that slopes away with a lovely sense of distance. But because I was using this scene for a drawing that was to do with explaining perspective and foreshortening, I wanted all of these lines to be nice and crisp and clear. And so I used the same pen throughout, and I drew everything with a detail and a preciseness that I wouldn't normally have employed for these further details. And this is how it looks. And while it's reasonably accurate, to me, this looks more like a diagram than a drawing. And if we compare the effect of this row of buildings sloping down the street with the one I showed you earlier here, where I've used all these techniques, all of these things to reflect the fact that what's in the distance is often more in our peripheral vision, and by doing the opposite in the closer areas, more detail, more precision, heavier lines, we create a focal point which aligns with what happens in life, which is that we are looking at one part of a scene in front of us, and we're only half seeing what slopes away from that focal point. And to my way of thinking, this creates an element of realism in our drawing that we don't get for all the accuracy and precision when we don't use it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Of course, what we draw and how we draw it, it's always something we get to decide on. And by deliberately manipulating our lines and our subject away from realism, we can create some amazing effects. And I follow some artists who do just that. But if drawing with a sense of realism is our aim, and if we're drawing from photo references, then understanding the limitations of those photographs is a great help in giving us focus and direction for how we need to draw to put back into our drawing what the photo has taken out of the scene. So whatever you're drawing, however you're drawing it, have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.